This is a time when we need to work together. Powerful forces challenge our hard-fought gains as friends and allies. Virulent nationalists, resurgent autocrats, digital extremists, terrorists. At the Atlantic Council, we work to galvanize a world community to defend our values: free speech, open markets, individual rights, rule of law. This year, we fought 24/7 to counter disinformation attacks on democracy. We campaigned to support our Atlantic allies against new threats. Our regional centers advanced security and freedom from Latin America to Africa, from the Middle East to Central Europe. We worked both sides of the aisle in Congress and at the highest levels of government. We convened the world's leading energy players to navigate transformative trends. We honored great leaders and global citizens who embrace our conviction that we are strongest when we work together to secure the future. Just as America needs friends and allies to succeed, so does the Atlantic Council.
We understand that we are stronger with allies working together than we are alone.
Join us.
Well, good morning, everyone. What a great pleasure it is to see so many people here today. As chairman of the board, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this year's Atlantic Council Forum. I'd like to extend a special welcome to my fellow Atlantic Council board directors. Welcome also to the almost 30 sitting ambassadors who will be with us throughout the day, the highest number we've ever had for this forum. This year, we've also invited some of the Council's most important and active corporate and individual members, and we're delighted to have so many of you with us today. To me, this audience speaks to the incredible community that the Atlantic Council is able to convene. A special thanks to George Lund, SK Group, and Bank of America for their generous support in making today's event happen. Also, a special thanks to Pavel Sirocco from PZU, whose generous contribution to the 3Cs initiative is really the first major investment in this project, and also to John Goodman of Accenture for his investment in our new, soon-to-be launched Geotech Center. So thank you to all of you for making this happen. As those of you who've joined us for the past annual forums will have noticed, this year's convening represents a dramatic expansion in scale and ambition. While remaining committed to offering a platform for the exchange of ideas on many of the world's most pressing issues, we made a deliberate effort this year to engage with an even wider group of senior decision makers and policy thought leaders. Indeed, this year's forum aims to catalyze the sorts of substantive conversations that have been at the core of the Atlantic Council's mission since its founding, to bridge the gap between various stakeholder communities inside and outside of government, and to shape the future together. Today, we're going to build on that mission with a series of deep dive discussions on issues that are of strategic importance to the Council, ranging from the role of Congress to America's role in the world, to the global economy, to technology's crucial impact on today's world order. Given our focus on today's role in the world, I'd like to highlight a new body of work that the Atlantic Council has initiated on the future of American leadership in the rules-based international order. As the United States and its global allies face an unprecedented set of complex challenges, the Council has launched a multi-year initiative aimed at analyzing the intersecting risks that lie at the heart of our mission and developing an actionable strategy to revitalize, adapt, and defend the rules-based order. This effort will result in several streams of work, mapping future global risks and identifying potential scenarios to best prepare and navigate a volatile world, producing a U.S. global strategy for revitalizing, adapting, and defending a rules-based international order, and preparing a declaration of principles to identify and articulate the fundamental tenets of a rules-based order to reaffirm public support in U.S. global leadership. A preview of the declaration and the other streams of work are contained at the registration desk, and we invite you to grab copies on your way out. Speaking of global leadership, I look forward to drawing on the vast expertise around the room to forge actionable solutions to the world's most pressing problems. Allow me to formally kick off today's program with our first session on the view from a Congress transformed, which will feature Congressman John Delaney of Maryland and Representative Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, moderated by our Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Really delighted you could be here with us this morning, and we're going to have really a great kickoff session in looking at the view from Congress transformed. And we're very delighted to have the Honorable John Delaney from the 6th District of Maryland, and also the Honorable Abigail Spanberger, who's the U.S. Representative-elect from Virginia, the 7th District. We're going to begin with Congressman Delaney, but let me make just a couple announcements. First, just to remind that our session is on the record, and also please turn off your cell phones. So if you haven't done that, take a moment, turn them off. Let me take also a moment, and I'm going to first introduce Congressman Delaney, and I want to do this with each of them individually before I pose a question, because it's interesting their backgrounds. And I think that's very much also part of the discussion today, is the composition of Congress and where members are coming from and what is important in terms of their own priorities and their own backgrounds. So Congressman John Delaney was elected in 2012 to serve Maryland's 6th District. And he is the only former CEO of a publicly traded company serving in the House of Representatives, and having done that twice, and you bring to Washington an extensive experience as a very successful entrepreneur, and also as a private sector and nonprofit leader. And significantly in that regard, I want to highlight the fact that he was elected co-president of his class in 2017. He was named as one of the 50 of the world's greatest leaders by Fortune magazine. Congratulations for that. And the only member of the House of Representatives to make that list. He's a graduate of Columbia University and Georgetown University Law Center. And you really categorize yourself, I think, as a business builder. You founded 2 New York Stock Exchange listed companies before the age of 40. And you're a past winner of the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award. A word about his involvement in business. He spent his business career starting and running successful companies and helping small businesses grow. And in that regard, his companies were both founded in Maryland, Capital Source, which he launched in 2000 and became a public company in 2003. It lent money to thousands of small businesses around the company, and it's been recognized by the Department of Treasury for lending to disadvantaged communities. I could really go on. I'm really cutting his short, and I'll be cutting Representative-elect Spanberger's bio short. But let me finally say one last thing about you, Congressman, before I'm going to pose the question. Your focus primarily in office has been on restoring our nation's economic competitiveness, and so that we can have a strong middle class and also raise our standard of living and expand the number of jobs available to Americans. So with that background about you, tell us about what you see as the role of Congress today in national security decision making, and what should be the role of the United States abroad.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Ambassador, for having me.
Delighted you're here.
It's great to be here. General Jones, I can't quite see with the lights, and Fred, thank you as well. And it's great to be here with Abigail, who is going to truly be an extraordinary member of Congress and bring tremendous expertise to the Congress. And we're lucky to have you in service to the country, so it's nice to be with you here, Abigail. Well, I think, Congress is a co-equal branch of government as it relates to foreign policy, in my judgment. And we do that in a variety of ways, which I think is very well known to this council because you're such a well-informed group of people. But we fund everything, including the military, the Department of Defense, the State Department. We approve treaties, we approve presidential appointments, we approve sanctions. A whole variety of things are done by the Congress that give us the ability, and obviously it should be approving any engagements overseas, give us the ability to shape foreign policy. And I think, in my judgment at least, over the last several decades, our track record of doing that has been very spotty, to say the least. And we should be more engaged in so many things as it relates to foreign policy, working with the president, who obviously has a huge portfolio of capabilities and powers as it relates to foreign policy. Yesterday, I think, was a good day for the Congress in terms of reasserting its role in foreign policy with what happened in the Senate, and I'm very pleased about that. I hope we take similar action in the House. But I think if you look at some of the things we've done across the last several decades, the fact that we have not had a debate on a new authorization for military force, and we've been relying on a 17-year-old document that is open-ended, and I don't think was envisioned that we'd be engaging the way we are globally based on putting that in place after 9/11. I think it's a great example of where Congress has failed its responsibility to have open debates in front of the American people about some of the most important foreign policy decisions this country's making. So I happen to be someone who believes that Congress should be a co-equal branch. We should be asserting that role. And our role in domestic policy, which is obviously central to the Congress, is, in my judgment, very much connected. I think as we go forward and think about foreign policy in this country, we have to think of kind of two ideas that, in my judgment, are very much interconnected. In other words, how do we reassert our competitive position globally in the world, our position as the leader in the world, militarily, diplomatically, economically, effectively having the head seat at all the important tables that are having discussions on all the important issues in the world. How do we reassert that role in a world that's changed fundamentally because of globalization and technological innovation and is changing very fast, while at the same time, how do we restore some of our economic strength here? Because unless this country and its middle class is growing and successful, that is the backbone of our ability to lead globally. And we have to stop thinking of these things as interconnected. I actually think they're very, very interconnected. We should be thinking globally, but continuing to invest locally so that we have the kind of economic growth our citizens deserve in this country, and that gives us the flexibility and the ability to finance our leadership position in the world, which I think is incredibly important. It has never been, at this moment in time, it seems to me, things that happen around the world have a more profound effect here in the United States than they ever have, which is why I think it's so important for us to have this leadership role.
Great opening for that. And I'm going to come back to you, however, and dig a little bit deeper on that second point. Let me introduce Congresswoman-elect Abigail Spanberger. She defeated Representative David Bratt and also Joe Walton in the November 6th general election to represent Virginia's 7th Congressional District. She began her career in public service as a federal law enforcement officer, by the way, working narcotics and money laundering cases with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. And she became very passionate about public service and languages, and that led you to join the Central Intelligence Agency as an operations officer. And in that capacity, she traveled widely, served at a wide variety of posts overseas, and dealing with a variety of high-level programs in service to the United States. She left the agency in 2014, and she left government service at that time to begin a career in the private sector, and also to come back to Virginia and her home in Virginia. She was working at EAB, Royal and Company, and basically with a focus on education, and here helping colleges, universities to create diverse student bodies, increase graduation rates, and also to break down financial barriers to higher education. She grew up in Short Pump in Henrico County and attended J.B. Tucker High School's Spanish immersion program. And you know I told you I have to mention it here, so I'm a Virginian. I grew up in Virginia, and I attended Thomas Jefferson High School, so I was comparing a few notes. And by the way, one of our board members, his wife, used to be principal, Jan Lodel, who's right here in the front of TJ. Admittedly, she was principal when it's a magnet school. I admittedly attended it when it was the regular public school, but we can compete over this. Anyhow, she also served significantly as a Senate page for U.S. Senator Chuck Robb and graduated from the University of Virginia. And after college, she moved to Germany and earned her MBA from a dual degree German-American program between the GISMA Business School and Purdue University. A very impressive international background. Representative-elect, let me ask you, please, same question. How do you see, coming into Congress, how do you see the role of Congress in national security decision-making? And also, what do you see as the role of the United States in the world today? And really welcome and congratulations to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for welcoming me here today. Thank you to everyone who's in attendance. I was very excited to hear John use the word interrelated. And I think my background as an intelligence officer, my background in national security, one of the things that is kind of foundational to national security is recognizing the interrelated nature of things, the interrelated nature of domestic policy and international policy, economic policy and educational policy and so forth. And I think that the role in Congress for those of us who are incoming is to really make sure that we are leading with those sorts of conversations. You know, I'm very focused on the needs of my district in Virginia, 7th District, Central Virginia, but so many of the needs and the priorities back home in my district do have a nexus to what's happening internationally, do have a nexus to whether or not Congress is, in fact, playing its constitutional role or not. And I would give the brief example of tariffs. We have a significant number of soybean farmers in my district, and the impact that our trade war has played in their livelihood is significant. And this is a place where, as an example, Congress really needs to be exercising its constitutional authority to have a voice and to make sure that we are executing on the power to tariff and levy taxes and assert the needs of the country as a whole, but in specific cases, our districts back home. In the transformation of Congress portion of the discussion, I think it's really noteworthy that there are many members of Congress, incoming members of Congress, who do have a background in national security, diplomacy, or with the armed forces. And I think for many of us, we're bringing a perspective of having spent a significant amount of time overseas, having spent a significant amount of time in service to this country in one role or another. And I believe that that perspective, that mission-focused perspective, and the perspective of having traveled, having seen the role that the United States does play internationally and should play and has played, will be helpful to many of us as we are looking at both that domestic policy and things that are impacting the everyday lives of our constituents back home, but also continuing to forge what is the path for the United States on an international scale.
It's also excellent beginning. Thank you. Let me take this point about how Congress does have clearly a role in foreign policy and national security decision-making. But let me challenge both of you. You know, when you look at the polls and the polls for presidential elections going back and up to the present, and no less congressional elections, national security never looms large. In fact, economy is always the #1 issue. And then you go down the list, and actually, I mean, national security is always towards the very end of the list. Now, I was very struck by what you just said, that a lot of members who have been recently elected, have national security backgrounds. Is that just by coincidence? I mean, what were the issues that really dominated in terms of your own election in the state of Virginia?
That's an interesting point. So in our district, the #1 issue is healthcare. It's the lack of affordable quality healthcare for many people throughout our district. After that, it was educational and economic opportunities. And from there, it went on to gun violence prevention, environmental issues. And you're right, national security was never really top of mind for people. What I think is very important to note, however, and when people would ask, well, you have this background in national security, how does that pivot towards service in Congress? How does that pivot towards serving this community? I think the important piece is not the direct relationship. I think it's the fact that there's a nexus to national security issues in everything I just mentioned. There's a nexus to national security in what our domestic gun violence prevention policies are. There's a clear national security priority with our environmental policy, frankly, with our healthcare policy, with our economic policy, all of it. And so while it isn't sort of top of mind for many voters, it is an underlying element of all of those domestic issues, back to the point of it being so interrelated. And I think that we do see so many former national security officers and individuals who worked in the national security or diplomatic realm who entered Congress or who decided to run for Congress in part because they recognized that there is a need for people to be asking really important questions, to be pushing on this mission first, serving the country as a priority, and particularly in such a partisan divide that we see so frequently in Congress. In the national security realm, we never talked about political party. We worked under one president or another president, and it was about focusing on that mission. And so I think to some degree that perspective of service first and party politics just being a part of the discussion is a pivot for many of us that I think is welcome to voters.
And Congressman, I know you want to add to this, but let me go back to what you also said. You indicated kind of a balance, because you mentioned the importance of domestic economic issues, but you also mentioned how they are interrelated and how Congress has to be engaged, America has to be engaged abroad. Elaborate further.
Sure. Let me just make one point on Abigail's
please.
last point, because I think it's so important. People like Abigail, who were elected, and so many other of the new members of Congress really had a background in service, right? Putting their country ahead of politics. And I think that was a big theme in why people like yourself and so many other people did so well this election, because it was so refreshing. Because polls may show that national security is low on people's mind, but what polls really tell you is that they hate politics.
Yes.
And the hyper-partisan nature of what they've witnessed, where we've basically spent all our time fighting and not any time doing and not putting the needs of the country first. And I think that was the message that came out of this election with the election of people like Abigail and others. So that I thought, I actually think that's the theme of the 2018 election to some extent. But back to your point. So they're obviously very interrelated. The American people fundamentally care mostly about their health care, as Abigail said, education, what's going on with their kids, opportunities for their children, and their jobs and their pay. Those kind of pocketbook, kitchen table issues, if we're not talking about those things 90% of the time, it's a real missed opportunity. Because when you talk to most Americans about what matters to them, that's what they're really concerned about, what's happening to them, their jobs, their children, and opportunities. I hear from so many people as I travel around this country, there's such a huge anxiety about, will my children be able to have a job in this community, or do they have to move away? So those are the issues that really matter to the American people. Now, our role internationally, we all know is linked to that, right? We all know is linked to that. So I think our job is to make sure people understand that, but they also understand that we're just not engaged in foreign expeditions all the time and forgetting about their basic needs at home. And I think that is the challenge. And clearly Congress, I mean, trade is a great example. I happen to be one of the Democrats who supported President Obama's effort to put in place the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I thought it was really good for us from a geopolitical standpoint, but also good from us from an economic standpoint. I thought it would have been better if it was paired with a national infrastructure program. So if we could go to the American people and say, listen, we're thinking globally, right? China is our greatest rival in the world by any measure. We have to be competing with them in Asia, right? This is good for our national security, and it's also good for us economically, but we're not forgetting about you, right? We're doing real things in your community. So I think it's incumbent upon Congress to always think about these things, both politically and as a matter of substance, as being paired, because they really are. I mean, if you think about whether it's pandemic risks, right? Whether it's terrorism, whether it's what's, China's emergence as our rival militarily and economically, and that is actually, to me, the biggest issue facing this country going forward, how we manage that transition. These are issues that really matter to people at home, and we see it with what's going on with trade right now. Right, it's massive dislocation, as Abigail talked about, and disruption in a lot of communities because of what's happening with trade.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then I want to come to the audience, because we want to really make this interactive. I don't want it just me asking the questions here. And so think about your questions, and I believe we have mics in the room. So we're going to come to you in a minute. Let me ask both of you, what would you pick out as maybe the top 3 national security issues which concern you the most? And I ask that because this audience, of course, is comprised of foreign policy experts. You have foreign ambassadors also here in this room. But what ties us all together is that keen interest and unity behind and concern about foreign policy issues today.
The top 3 things that I would raise, one would be, and John mentioned this, I believe that we need, and Congress needs to take action on putting an updated authorized use of military force in place. We are sending soldiers overseas under an old assertion of what we saw and thought was necessary within the world. It is a way that Congress doesn't have to use its voice, use its authority, have an open, open and transparent debate about where it is that we are engaging militarily. And I think that that is something, as a domestic policy issue, we need to pursue, but it is, foundationally also our engagement internationally. That's number 1. Number 2 is I believe that we need to take action to ensure that we are doing the right things in terms of trade policy, and specifically as it comes to tariffs and antagonizing our friends and allies throughout the world with our aggressive tactics as it relates to tariffs. It is hurting people in districts like mine across the country. It is also hurting our position in the world and our relationships with so many other countries. And then the third thing is more values-based. I have significant concerns about the place of how we are engaging with countries throughout the world, with the position of American leadership in the world, how we as a country present ourselves, and what it is that we are conveying about our priorities. I think that we have had some missteps in the past 2 years, and I think that we need to do a good job of making sure that we are in the pursuit of our domestic policy and our international policy, recognizing that we have historically played a very strong role as a stabilizing force and positive example in the world, and that we should always have that be as our goal. And whether we can meet that standard every time, that can be up for debate, but that should always be our foundational goal.
Okay.
I agree with everything Abigail just said, and I think she said it really well. And adding to that list, obviously, nuclear proliferation is always the biggest risk in many ways, right? God forbid something ever were to happen anywhere in the world, it would completely change the trajectory of the world. And we successfully had one transition of the Soviet Union to Russia. We will inevitably have another leadership succession that has to happen with Russia at some point in the future, and ensuring that that transition is done successfully, plus the other efforts of whether it non-state actors or even state actors to obtain nuclear weapons is a huge risk. I think China's ability to repel us, if you will, from the Asia-Pacific region militarily, and how we actually have to how we'd have to fight back or reassert ourselves is something we always have to be thinking about. And then I think, we've got just this artificial intelligence kind of privacy. We don't have a strategy for dealing with it. And, China in particular does have a strategy. They're investing heavily. They don't have the kind of protections that we give our consumers, which I think we're obviously right about, but gives them some inherent advantages there. So this whole cyber artificial intelligence world is very troubling in terms of what it could be doing to our safety and security.
Let me ask one more, and like I said, we're going to go to you. I want to ask about bipartisanship, and I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to start with you, Congressman Delaney. China. I think that most on the outside, not that there aren't differences on tactics and approaches, but would you say that on the issue of China today, that there is a kind of bipartisan support and also executive, legislative view is that something's got to really be done vis-a-vis China? There may be differences about the approach, the tactics, but that the American public itself has really spoken to this issue about unfair trade practices, et cetera. Let's hear your views on a bit on China.
So, yeah, I think there is bipartisan support. I mean, I haven't agreed with the president's tactics, but I think his instincts are correct that we do have a big issue with China. How I would go about dealing with them is very different, because I think we need to build our, we need to get all of our allies and our really our private economy all on the same page if we actually want to confront the threat of China. I mean, China became our rival economically for 3 reasons. They worked really hard, they made smart investments, and they didn't play by the rules, right? So in this next chapter, right, which is all going to be about technology, we have to make sure they play by the rules. And the only way to do that is to work with our allies and to get our private companies all on the same page and have a unified front. But I do think there's tremendous bipartisan support on the notion that we have economic, national security, military issues with China. Some people characterize it as in the fact that we're already in a second Cold War. Other people have a different view. But I think there's a lot of bipartisan support on that, and I think we need to be taking a very aggressive posture. If you look at what they're doing around the world, if you look at what they're doing with influence campaigns in this country, if you look at what they're doing on college campuses in this country, if you look at what they're doing with cyber hacks, et cetera, if you look at the capabilities they're creating for their military in the region, if you look at what they're doing with what I consider to be illegal islands in the South China Sea, and just our kind of economic competitiveness with them, I think it's a big issue, and it's going to be one of the central issues for this Congress going forward and in the 2020 election.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you want to comment further? Or?
I think you about covered it.
Okay, all right. Let's go to the audience. Do we have mics? Let's start right here in front, and we're going to go right back. There are 3 hands here. Yes, at this table, that. It's hard to see in the light. Okay, and please introduce yourselves.
Hilda Ochoa. How are you, John?
Hello, Hilda.
I want to talk about the forgotten issue of national security, and that is immigration policy. And I will tell you why. The greatest domestic issue the U.S. is confronting right now is the income disparity, not the one that Jeff Bezos makes too much relative to a blue-collar worker or any of us. It is the fact that the middle class is retiring, and is retiring. Those baby boomers, the largest portion of the U.S. population, is retiring right now already, and over the next 10 years, they will become the new poor. They have not saved enough for their retirement. And there is a silver bullet for that, and that silver bullet is an intelligent immigration policy. If we recruit 2.5 million immigrants a year, we will not have the demographic income disparity problem that we're all ignoring, but it's happening. So give him a wall and solve the immigration policy issue. Give him a fence. Do something that this is resolved.
All right, we'll get your responses in a minute. Let's go, if we pass the mic back, I think that's Nelson Cunningham right there. Yes, if you'll reintroduce yourself, Nelson.
Thank you, Nelson Cunningham with McClarty Associates. By the way, long ago I started life as an assistant U.S. attorney in New York, and the very best law enforcement officers I ever worked with were the postal inspectors. So you started in a good place. And I can see why the rest of your career went the way it did. The trade debate that you both touched on is about to get very concrete, because shortly after the start of the year, I think the president will send up this new revised NAFTA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. And Speaker Pelosi, the last time she got a trade agreement from a Republican president, the Colombia agreement, she just put it in a drawer. She stopped the legislative clock and stuck it in a drawer and didn't deal with it until Barack Obama became president and it could be revised. I'm not sure she'll have that luxury now as Speaker. One of the first challenges she'll have is, what does she do with this trade agreement with a NAFTA that may be about to expire if the president pulls it out? I'd love some insights into what Congresswoman-elect Spanberger thinks the new Speaker may do on these issues.
All right, let's take these two, and then we're going to go to 2 at the back. Would you like to begin on that one and work backwards? You know, it was directed to you on trade and what may happen.
I can't begin to kind of venture a guess as to what Democratic leadership may do, in particular related to the revised NAFTA. But I will say that in all of our initial conversations within the Democratic caucus, and John may be able to provide a little bit more historical context from his longer time there. I've been there now 3 weeks in orientation. But all of our conversations within within the Democratic caucus have been focused on where it is that we can make progress, where it is that we can find common ground, and from a bipartisan perspective, but also move things forward. Recognizing the priority that the president does put on this effort, I think it's something that we may not be able to table if that's something that leadership might be inclined to do. But I do hope that we would be able to have really fruitful conversations about the negatives and the benefits. And certainly I think that in a district like mine that is a heavily agricultural district with a lot of dairy farms, for example, there's been significant discussions about the change of the impact there. So I can't begin to venture a guess as to what it is that she may do, but I do think that it will be necessary that we at least engage in conversations about the president's priority in that realm, and how that might make it so that that we have to kind of move that discussion to the floor. I don't know. John, would you add something there?
No, I think you said it perfectly. I do think the Democratic Party has changed a little bit. And it kind of ties in with what Hilda said, right? Because, again, as one of the 28 people who supported Obama's effort to do TPP, and I still have the lumps from it, the party's in a bit of a different spot now because we have a president who, in our judgment, is an isolationist and a nationalist. And he wants to build a wall, tears up Paris climate, questioned NATO, suggested that other countries should get nuclear weapons. So it's changed the Democratic Party a little bit in our headset. And I think we realize, and I think it was I actually think this was one of the reasons we lost the election, in my own humble opinion, is we realized that the Democratic Party and the values we stand for should be engaging globally in building this world order, and trade is central to that, right? You should not be having a national security or diplomatic discussion with a foreign country without having your economic team at the table as well. So my sense of the Congress is the coalition of Democrats that supported, because let's face it, the new NAFTA is kind of TPP in part. The Democrats who supported it are still there. We got a bunch of really terrific new members coming in, and you've got as good of an example as that on the stage here today. And I think a lot of them ran in competitive districts and are talking more balanced about this issue. So, I'm hopeful that we could have a good discussion on it. So that would be my view. But Hilda, I'm glad you brought up immigration and I want to call out Hilda. She's done some of the best work anyone's done on thinking about the economic impact of immigrants, including doing a calculation as to how much the United States saves on education costs based on the fact that a lot of immigrants come to this country already educated. Right, and that's an investment we're not actually making in those people, which is the investment we make in everyone else, yet they provide an economic return. So I want to give you a shout out for that, Hilda. But I think you're right. I mean, but it all goes to this view of, are we engaging in the world? And sure, we always have to be updating our immigration policy. I was totally in favor of the 2012 bipartisan immigration reform bill. And I think we should be going right back to that, right? Because that's a deal that the American people support. It does everything we need to do. It deals with a pathway to citizenship. It reforms the visa programs, and it puts a ton of money on the border. So I'm glad you brought it up. It's critical to what I think all believe in the Democratic Party, at least, that we should be doing comprehensive immigration reform. We're a nation of immigrants, and just from an economic model, if we close our borders, we're making a decision as a country to stop growing. And as you know, countries that don't grow and suddenly have declining birth rates, that's a terrible economic picture.
Yeah. We'll take two more questions. I think there were, yes.
Abigail wanted to add something on
I
that real quick.
apologize.
Sorry.
Well, and I would simply add to that for many of us newly elected members of Congress, immigration reform and comprehensive immigration reform is a priority. And recognizing that the Senate had previously reached a point where they had found bipartisan agreement, and notably even in the House of Representatives, there was a bipartisan bill not nearly as comprehensive as the Senate bill a number of years earlier, but that bill couldn't even get out of committee. So I do think there is a critical mass at this point of new members and existing members who do need to make progress on this. And part of the discussion I think that has been absent is the economic piece of it. And again, across our district, I have a suburban district and a rural district. This is actually one of the top issues that comes up in my rural communities because it's a job force, it's a labor issue. And so there's been a lot of talk of how we can expand access to visas so that people can hire the workforce and the skilled workforce and the unskilled workforce that they in fact need to run their businesses across our district, but the country overall as well.
We're going to take two more. We have one at the back there. Well, actually, why don't we take those two right at the back there, right together, and we'll take you in the front, and then we need to close it because we're trying to run on time. Yes, and if I could ask you guys to be brief.
Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. Yesterday's Senate vote on the Sanders-Lee Yemen resolution, not sure if it was a watershed, but I do think it established some ground about how lawmakers can have debates on this, that they can have debates on germane amendments, that it doesn't become a vote-a-thon, that it doesn't have to bring down floor action. What do you think it means for the Congress that vote happen, recognizing the resolution will not become law this year?
Okay, and if you'll pass the mic to the gentleman right in front of you. He's right there. Thank you.
Todd Sedgwick, Atlantic Council Ambassadorial Advisory Council. Question is, where do you both stand on the the whole debate on the War Powers Act? And beyond holding the purse strings, what is the Congress's role precisely in waging war?
By the way, thank you both for also being very brief. And you have the last one, and if we'll be brief, and we'll get their closing comments addressing all three.
Thank you, Paula Stern. Asking my question is based on the book I wrote almost 50 years ago called Water's Edge, Domestic Politics and the Making of American Foreign Policy, which focused on how Congress asserted itself, particularly at a time when the president was increasingly at that time under a lot of attack, self-inflicted wounds, etc. And the role that Congress played, not only with regard to the increase in the War Powers Act, the Javits legislation, which is still on the books, but with regard to trade, which under the Constitution also is Congress's prerogative, particularly the House of Representatives. Putting on your policy hat within the Congress, the two of you all together, I think, could do a great job for the whole 535. How will Congress go about in the year 2019 in the new Congress asserting itself, particularly on trade, as well as with regard to the War Powers Act, vis-a-vis the executive branch?
All right, thank you. Would you like to, you want to work backwards? All right.
Sure. And I'll start with a couple of comments. I think part of the difficulty that we're seeing, particularly in recent years, let's say the past 20 years, is it is, I think, to some degree, a fear of having really difficult, hard conversations about trade policy, hard conversations about tariffs, hard conversations about our military engagement. But it is the role of Congress to have those hard conversations, to have that vigorous debate, and to communicate well to the American people why they advocate for this or that. And I think that in our political spectrum, so not necessarily the policy space, but in the political spectrum, it has been easier and easier for many politicians to retreat from that because you're going to have to basically avoid a hard conversation that might come back to haunt you later, or a hard stance that might be used against you later. But I think that foundationally, the role of Congress, as it is laid out in the Constitution, as it has traditionally been a co-equal branch of our government, it mandates that we have leaders who are willing to have hard conversations about trade policy, about our engagement internationally. And I think it's an obligation and a responsibility, and ideally one that in this next Congress, in this coming year, we'll be able to get a little bit away from that political side of it and just have earnest conversations, because the fact that I might disagree with the president on a particular issue should be that disagreement on that particular issue rather than a political party versus political party discussion. And so I think one of it is Congress and members of Congress need to reassert themselves into the role that they were actually elected to play, and advocate for taking on the responsibility that constitutionally they hold, even when it is difficult politically, because indeed it's what they were elected to do. And that carries over to conversations related to our engagement internationally, militarily. Congress should be the one that is having hard conversations about where we do engage militarily, where we send service members, and the fact that in recent years Congress has been able and willing to step back from that responsibility, to me, I think is detrimental to the country long term, and it has set a difficult precedent that hopefully we will walk back from. Related to the vote in the Senate yesterday, I hope that's an example of members of Congress, in this case on the Senate side, showing a willingness to stand up for values that are kind of foundational to who we are as a people, but also stand up and have a hard conversation on the floor of the Senate and put down a marker for what they believe to be acceptable or unacceptable.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Abigail just said. And I think, and to some extent, all those questions were interrelated and in many ways answered each other, because yesterday I thought was a great day in the Congress with what the Senate did. They basically voted to end a war they didn't authorize, right? Which is kind of interesting if you think about it. And as someone who has been a strong advocate for us debating a new authorization for military force, which is not only, I think, what the American people deserve, but it's what I think our military deserves. Because I get so many comments from people who talk about our military budget, and I'm like, well, that's actually not the issue. The issue is, what do we ask our servicemen and women to do? Because once we ask them to do something, we obviously have to fund it. So what we need are more conversations about what the mission is. And the thing about Congress is we're not only a co-equal branch of government, but we're so connected to the American people because we have to run every 2 years. It's true. And that was by design, right? And that's a good model. We go back to our districts, we hear from our constituents. I remember when I was first elected and suddenly we were debating whether to bomb Syria, which is not a topic I had given a lot of thought to in my prior life as an entrepreneur. And I remember just the feedback from my constituents was just overwhelming. And it's just a great reminder why we have to be involved in these debates if we're going to have a representative democracy. And I think what happened yesterday in the Senate was terrific, right? Because I've watched for the last several years where Congress has not exercised its authority as a co-equal branch, in my opinion, and has been woefully inadequate in the exercise of that very significant responsibility. And yesterday, the Congress stood up and said, listen, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was atrocious. And we're not going to send a signal to the rest of the world that they can get away with this. And we're going to do something about it. And I thought that was a great day in actually the history of the Congress and in many ways in the history of our government right now. And I'm hopeful, whether it's be reasserting our authority on trade, because there's no reason why we can't have more say on how tariffs are imposed, et cetera. We have the ability to do that. And with hopefully having more debates on trade agreements, and hopefully getting back to this framework of how we actually wage war, either through emergency action by the president or through an authorization for military force or through actually declaring war, that we actually follow those rules. I think that the country would be so much better served if Congress reasserts itself in that regard. And then it forces the president and the Congress to really lead together, which is, I think, what the American people deserve.
Congressman Delaney and Congresswoman-elect Spanberger, this has been great. You've been a great launch for our forum and our beginning discussion today. Thank you so much for coming. Please join me in thanking them. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a break now, and we will reconvene and with the focus on U.S. foreign policy.